Shannon Baptist Church exists to make, mature, and multiply disciples of Jesus Christ one life at a time in the Midlands and beyond.
Well, moms and dads, remember when your children were first learning to walk and you wanted to hold their hands or put your arms under theirs to catch them when they stumbled? And if you are still at the stage of guiding your little ones, you know well how easily they can fall if they're not supported. Hi, everyone. I'm Dondi Mercer-Plank, and today on our Shannon Plus podcast, Dr. Daniel Dickert joins me with why the concept is the same in our Christian walks. So, Daniel, you know well, as your youngest, Callie Jane, is at that stage where she needs your guidance. And what happens if you don't give it to her? Crash.
Crash. That's exactly right. I can't imagine that if we were not paying attention with having 3 other kids in the home. I mean, who knows? The kids might be, carrying her up the stairs upside down. It requires constant attention and accountability. And, I just think about how, as Callie Jane is still a baby around the age of 1, if she requires attention, how much more does that new believer require attention as well? If I were to put Callie Jane in a room and say, all right, learn to fend for yourself.
Good luck, right?
Good luck.
Mm-hmm.
That would be parental neglect. And yet we so often do that to young Christians, and we call that church.
Yeah, so how does that need for support relate to a person's spiritual walk?
Yeah, I think that it's very similar. New believers and even believers who are growing, they need support from someone who has walked with the Lord a few steps in front. And that's why we believe in discipleship. Discipleship is important from an accountability standpoint, but also from a relational standpoint. I mean, I think about, my earthly dad, as he helped me learn to throw a football, as he taught me how to construct a paragraph, and he helped me with my homework. And now years later, I'm doing that for my own children, just as any parent would. And we often say it's not just what's taught, it's what's caught. And that's what Christian discipleship is. I mean, it's not simply, teaching theory. It's walking alongside people and helping them, offering the guidance in their spiritual walk. So what does that look like? Well, it's teaching folks how to pray, but not just giving them the theory on prayer. It's, hey, let's pray together. It's when you go out for a meal and you talk to that waiter or waitress and you talk to them briefly in 30 seconds about your relationship with the Lord and say, do you have a similar story? You're helping others as it comes to them growing in their faith. So when it comes to the support related to a person's spiritual walk, it's not always what's taught, it's what's caught. And we're to do this for the person who is growing in their faith to help them get to that point of spiritual maturity.
Like as we take Callie Jane as an example, little children, we've seen all of them say, no, like when they're starting to learn to walk, they want to do it themselves. They want to go it alone. Why do so many Christians despise the need for accountability? Many would just prefer isolation. Many would be like a little child like Callie Jane who wants to walk it alone.
In short, Dondi, I think the reason is twofold: pride or sin. Now, it could be pride because we don't want someone to tell us what to do or show us what to do. But as I believe it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who once said, the more isolated a person is, the more prone to sin's desires they become. Or you could put it this way: the more isolated the Christian is, the more prone he is to sin. So sin is the combination, I believe, of 4 factors: an unyielded heart, an undetected weakness, an unexpected occasion, and an unguarded life. Let me talk about each of those as it relates to the lack of accountability. Number 1, an unyielded heart. The heart that is surrendered is the heart that is protected. So when our heart is unyielded to God, when we are going about the Christian life in a laissez-faire approach, that we give the opportunity for Satan to attack us. Satan is constantly watching. Now, he's not the only enemy that we have. It's also our internal desires, those desires that are not from the Lord. It's also the evil world system that the Bible talks about there in 1 John chapter 2, but also Satan, that he wants to attack us, and he is looking for that unyielded heart, for that person that's just casually approaching the Christian life and not doing it in full surrender. So, an unyielded heart. I think about David. David had an unyielded heart. It said there in 1 Samuel that in the time when kings go out to war, that he was idle, and you know the old adage, idle hands are the devil's workshop. So he had an unyielded heart, but not only an unyielded heart, an undetected weakness. We all have spiritual weaknesses, those areas in our life. In fact, I would commend this book to our listeners. Jerry Bridges, he wrote a great book called Respectable Sins. And he talks about how as Christians, we often downplay these subtle sins, but often subtle sins are the most dangerous sins. And these undetected weaknesses in our own life, I think that's one of the reasons, Donnie, that we need accountability, is that our friends can see the undetected weaknesses, the blind spots, so to speak, in our life, but also those unexpected occasions. Sin is not on our calendar, at least not for many of us, but those opportunities for sin, they pop up unannounced. Most people don't begin the day and say, well, hey, I'd like to succumb to temptation today. But it's when they're tired. It's when they're alone. It's when they're fearful. It's these unexpected occasions that are used to trip us up. So sin could also be the result of an unexpected occasion or an unguarded life. Proverbs 4 says, guard your life or your heart, for it's the wellspring of life. You show me an unguarded individual, and I'll show you someone that Satan will eventually trip up. You know, the Bible talks about putting on the full armor of God, not just part of the armor. We have to put on all the armor. We can't just take the breastplate of righteousness, but we leave out the sword of the Spirit, or we leave out the shoes of peace. We have to put on the full armor of God if we are going to be guarded. So I think one of the reasons that people are prone to sin, it's because of these areas: an unyielded heart, an undetected weakness, an unexpected occasion, and an unguarded life.
And the best way to protect your heart is to have others watching over it. I love an illustration that you've brought to my attention before about the Roman soldiers going into battle. And if you could just bring that up and explain how those soldiers are locking arms and supporting one another.
So it's said that when the Roman soldiers would go into battle, they would line up together to interlock their arms. Now, if you study how the Romans would form in battle, and particularly with their shields, they would often have these interlocking positions, and their battle position symbolized more than strength in numbers. It was a formation of support. If one soldier fell, there were two soldiers on either side to pick up the fallen soldier. That is one reason we all need accountability. There will be days when we fall, and we need other Christians there to pick us up. And could it be that the reason God provided the church as his plan A for discipleship is because he knew we could not cross the finish line without the accountability of others? So as the church locks arms together, let's say that you have your arm locked beside person A and person B, and as they fall down, you are there to pick them up. You know, as Christians, we shouldn't delight or gloat in when other believers fall, but instead we should be the first ones to pick them up. You know, right now my daughter Carolina, she's in the stage where, you know, she'll get boo-boos from being outside, from falling down, and she'll immediately run into the house and she's crying, Dondi. And we are there to not only pick her up, but to help her in her defeat. In the same way that as Christians, when other Christians fall, we should be there with spiritual band-aids, ready to not only pick them up, but also to help them from the scars and from the wounds of this world.
And to prevent isolation, we have to, like you said, lock arms. Most churchgoers want their congregations to grow, but explain why bigger churches have a bigger responsibility to make sure that that doesn't enable a Christian to be isolated. Because the bigger the church, it is easy to just go in, listen to the sermon, and slip out the door.
That's right. In larger churches, that it's much easier to approach the worship service the way that many consumers approach a drive-through today. Drive-through Christianity. We'll show up for the worship service. We won't say hey to too many people. We'll sit in the back, and then we're quickly out. The problem with that is the church is not an event that we attend. It's to be a family that we belong to. And in a larger church, Dondi, I think the challenge is that you can easily slip through the cracks. So for just, an example, a normative church in America, I believe that today the average size is 91 people. You may be today, if you're listening, in a church smaller than 91, and there's no problem with that. You could be in a church that is much larger, that there are thousands who worship together on a Sunday. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Really, the size is not the issue. Instead, the size of the accountability is the issue. And I think the larger the church, the more mechanisms that we need to have in place to make sure that the one doesn't slip through the crack. In Luke 15, Jesus, he says that he would leave the 99 to go after the one. Well, the reason that he could leave the 99 and go after the one is because most sheep in that day, they were counted. They were tagged, just like they are today. We've got to know those who are falling down in order for us to be able to pursue them. So I think, in a large church, you lose that relational aspect for the effectiveness and the efficiency of the sometimes so-called performance or the quality. But if we're not relationally connected to others within the church, it's easy for us not to pursue them, pursuing that one as they fall down. And so, the size of the church is not the issue. It's the size of the accountability that's the issue. But for larger churches, I think there is the onus and the impetus that we must make sure that people don't fall through the cracks, because every life matters to God.
It does. And so we want to look at the best way for a person to protect his or her heart. How can like-gendered accountability play into that? Because that's something that we have here at Shandon.
Yeah, this would be an overgeneralization, but I don't find many, let's say it, men, Dondi, who are in a co-ed Sunday group. They attend with their spouse to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm really struggling in an area in my marriage right now. Can everybody help me? That would bring shame to the spouse sitting right beside them. Or I haven't found many ladies, for that matter, that they're in a large co-ed group that would say, hey, I struggle with, call it gossip or bitterness. But when we get into these smaller settings of trusted individuals, and I think that's one of the key to discipleship groups. They have to be accountable, but accountability runs on the rails of trust. You show me an organization where there's no trust, and I'll eventually show you an organization with no accountability. So I think that in order for these smaller groups to work, there has to be trust, and just in a larger group, it's impossible to find the accountability that we need. There are too many people, too many voices, but if you have a trusted community, whether that's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 individuals that come together, you have the accountability that you need. So how does this work out in the group that I'm in? Sometimes people ask me, well, Pastor, tell us about your discipleship group. Well, as we gather on Monday mornings and we walk through the scriptures, I'm highlighting in my Bible and writing down thoughts as I read a chapter that I've been assigned in the quiet time. And we talk about it as our group. We then have that time of praying for one another. The scripture memorization is one of the hardest parts. As we've said, we want to use the same translation, Dondi, so that we're accountable to one another, even that no one can take shortcuts. But then it's that time where they look at me and they say, Daniel, how have you been as a husband this week? Have you been more committed to the bride of Christ or to Cassie? Have you sacrificed your family on the altar of ministry? Daniel, is there anything your eyes have seen this week that would be dishonoring to God? What about your attitudes? How about your actions to those that you get to work alongside? And I have men in my life who are looking at me, and I've told them that, hey, you have access to my life. In fact, even the accountability of some of those on our staff, I mean, I've told our executive pastor, hey, you have access. If you ask for my phone, that I'll unlock it at any point, because I want there to be full transparency, because we are dangerous as Christians when we are unaccountable. Everybody should be accountable to and responsible for. So for the person that they wonder, well, can I really be accountable? Maybe you're a pastor listening today, and I know there was the old wisdom of maybe a former generation that they said, well, don't be too close to those in the church. I think that's bad wisdom altogether, and here's why I think that is, Dondi. Every shepherd should also not only smell like a sheep, every shepherd to some degree is still a sheep. And so, yes, you have the responsibility of being the shepherd, but you're also still a sheep. And you need others in your life. We see these stories of how pastors have recently fallen out of the ministry. I'm not going to name names on the podcast, but I'm sure that if you're listening, you can probably think of 5 to 10 people who have fallen out of ministry. And I think that the reason they fell out of ministry, Donnie, is 2 reasons. I think, number 1, a lack of accountability. But I think 2, unprotected desires. So think of this as both offense and defense. There are ways that if you want to get around accountability that you can. I've seen it before. Even if you put so-called, software on your phone to try to get around, there are ways around accountability. So you have to have those unprotected desires, but also the accountability. Maybe for you, the issue who's listening, it could be gossip. Well, there's areas that you can get around that from accountability. You can try to mask it or hide it. But on the other side of things, you have to protect those desires that don't align to the Lord. So think of this as offense and defense. On the one hand, you need accountability. That's the defense. But the offense is going to war against these desires that don't honor the Lord. I mean, it says there in Romans chapter 6, it says that don't let this sin wage war against your body. So we've got to fight both on offense and defense, but one of the ways that we have victory is through that defensive accountability.
You see accountability not as an invasion, but as a protection. Mm-hmm. And when you're protected, it's just that. You're protected.
Yeah.
You are kept from later going, if only.
That's exactly right. To use a football analogy, every quarterback has a good left tackle that's able to protect his blind spot. Every Christian must have a good left tackle, that being some folks in your life that are going to point out those areas. In fact, one of the best accountability partners that I have is my wife, Cassie. And that, she'll say, hey, Daniel, I see these trends, and not to get defensive. The goal is not to get defensive. Why? I know that Cassie has my best interest. She loves me. She wants to see the best. And so when you have people in your life that can point out those weaknesses, well, it's only going to strengthen you. And so I think we shouldn't run from accountability. We should run to it, knowing that it's going to strengthen us.
I'm sorry. I'm sitting here smiling because I'm thinking of all the wives right now who are going, oh, I can't wait to. I have a list. And as your helpmate, I'm going to help you know. We do know what you're talking about. That's awesome. So do have some Roman soldiers in your life with whom you can lock arms, everyone, and be accountable and look at it not as an invasion into your privacy, but a protection of your spiritual walk. In our next Shandon Plus podcast, why making disciples is not the ministry of trained professionals. It is the ministry of the whole church. One thing really neat about that is that we all have a role. All of us, everyone listening right now, you are needed. For Shandon Plus Podcast, I'm Dawn D. Mercer Plank.
And I'm Daniel Dickard, Senior Pastor of Shandon Baptist Church, signing off. We'll see you next week.